Imagine getting spawned in another world just to realize that you're broke. So just like real life, and dad really went downtown because also you have 7 other siblings. A boy named Phil appears in an unpaved place that looks like a desert and is accompanied by some workers carrying axes. Then Phil uses his magical ability to pave the road so that they can walk into it and start working. After Phil made sure everything was okay, he told his assistant Rodrigue that he was going home, then used teleportation and returned home, exhausted, to a group of girls who greeted him. The girls notice that his relationship with Rodrigue seems to be reversed, as if he's the one working for him. Phil says that no matter how high he rises, he still feels like an employee. He then realizes that he's not adjusted to his new life after 10 years and decides to head to his room. 10 years ago, a young man dressed in formal clothes lay on his couch at home, feeling tired from hard work and almost falling asleep on his couch. But he resisted and prepared dinner for himself. After he finished cooking, he sat down at the table to eat, but he couldn't help himself and fell asleep while sitting in front of the food. And when he woke up, he found that he was sitting in front of a different plate on a different table, and he felt that he also looked different when he saw the size of his small hand. He looked at the reflection of one of the dishes and found that he looked like a small child and was wearing different clothes, and he was more surprised when he looked around and found many people as if he was at a wedding. So he felt the food with his finger to make sure that what was around him was not a fantasy and felt that he was in a realistic dream. But he wanted to return to reality quickly, so he closed his eyes but failed to return to normal. Then someone interrupted him and asked him to go and greet the guests. Then the person took him and directed him towards a group of guests and told them that he was his youngest son, and then asked him to introduce himself. The child felt very nervous in front of them because he didn't know who he was and where he was. Then he looked at them and was about to say something, but he was interrupted by a young man named Eric who thanked the guests for attending his older brother Kurt's wedding. Then Eric went to the child and told him that he was his younger brother and his name was Phil Baumister. The child realized that this is his new name in their world and had to go along with what was happening until the end. Then he returned to the table again with Eric, and his brother asked him. His mind was confused because he was surrounded by adults. Phil was surprised to learn that he was a 5-year-old boy and asked him what was going on. Eric told him they were at the wedding of their older brother Kurt and his wife Amay, and was surprised when Eric told him they were a noble family. After that, Phil went to the lobby and seemed surprised by everything around him, but he felt a little safe because everyone spoke the same language as him and felt that his family had a high status for holding such a huge wedding. Then he sat down to eat his food with pleasure, not caring to think about what happened to him suddenly, and it seems that stupidity takes over when he is hungry. The next day, Phil sat down to eat his breakfast and was surprised to find a plate of dry bread and water soup in front of him and all his family members eating the same thing. And when he looked around, he found that their house looked very old and the furniture was worn out. Then he asked about his brother Eric, and their mother told him that he had gone fishing. So he waited until he returned home and wondered about their situation, and was shocked when Eric told him that they were actually poor despite the huge wedding they had thrown for Kurt. Phil thought that they might be poor, but they were still noble and that he should at least have some privileges. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of their third brother Hamlet, and he was surprised that he had another brother and that he was considered the 4th son in his family's lineage. Then he saw another brother, Paul, join them on his way home from work. Then Herman and Eric mentioned that their brothers Walter and Carl had not attended yesterday's wedding, and was shocked to realize that he was the 8th son in the poor noble family. He then examined the map of his new world and found that he lived in a rural area called Baumeister's Chivalry with a population of only 800, and then he felt frustrated with his new miserable life as the 8th son of an impoverished noble family. Then he found that his mother was saying goodbye to Eric and his siblings, so he rushed towards them and asked where they were going. Eric told him that they had already agreed to leave the house after Kurt's marriage, but he would stay at home since he was still a child. He told them that they could stay and inherit their land, but his brothers told him that they were poor and had no right to do so, and instead of dividing it between them, they would give up their rights in a cash settlement with Kurt, so that all the land would belong to him and they would no longer be noblemen. Phil was furious and asked them how they were going to move forward once they were no longer noble. They told him that Herman had married into the sub-family to secure himself, and that they would have to find their own way in the capital according to their skills. Eric approached him and warned him not to be lazy, lest he regret it in the future. Then they left the village and Phil bid them a warm farewell, as if he had many memories with them, even though he had only met them yesterday. After that, he went to the library of their house and started looking for any useful book until he dropped a crystal and some papers. Then he picked up the paper and learned that the crystal can measure one's efficiency in magic. He was not convinced at first that magic is real in this world, but he realized that it is not a joke when he read that everyone has what is known as mana, but only 1 in 1,000 has enough mana to cast spells. Phil put the crystal on the table and decided to try the experiment out of curiosity. Then he put his hand towards it, and when nothing happened, he thought it was just a joke and left, but he was surprised by the glow of the crystal. So he grabbed the paper in front of him and read that the glow of the crystal and the colors of the spectrum means that the person has high magical efficiency and that he should learn magic under the supervision of specialists. Phil did not believe believe what happened in front of him and did not realize that he had tremendous magical abilities, and he kept looking for more evidence among the books, but he did not find a single book talking about magic, but all novels and poems until his father entered, and then Phil asked him if they had books somewhere else. Then he was surprised when his father told him that he could not read in the first place and asked him to go to the forest and get some firewood. Phil went into the forest and tried to cast some spells on his own, but to no avail. He was then interrupted by someone with blonde hair who looked scary at first glance, as he resembled Johan from the anime monster, and then told Phil that he felt his magical competence earlier and realized that they had the same wavelength. Phil felt afraid of this person and tried to protect himself with a small branch he was holding in his hand, but the person took the branch from his hand and told him that there was no need to be afraid because he was a magician like him, and when he threw the branch away, it happened to hit a large rock that fell on the back of a wild boar. When they came closer to check the forest below, the boar saw them and started chasing them, so Phil ran away. When the boar went up the hill, the magician grabbed Phil and told him that he had to visualize his magic to be able to use it. Then he asked him to visualize the wind magic, but Phil was terrified and unable to understand what he was saying. The magician told him that he must accept the mana inside him and then allow it to walk inside his body, and as soon as he did so, he was surprised by his tremendous magical abilities that repelled the pig's attack, and the magician told him that he was able to use his first magic spell. Then the magician used his ability and pushed the pig with all his strength away and made him cut trees in his path until he fell to the ground, motionless. The magician then introduces himself to Phil and tells him that his name is Alfred Reincarnated, a former court magician in the Duchy of Blyckreader, and that he will teach him magic. Phil sat drinking a drink with Alfred and was surprised that he sucked the paint inside his sleeve, and Phil asked him why he wanted to teach him magic and that he had no money to pay him, so he told him that he did not want money, but all he wanted was a student to pass his magic to him. So Phil was excited about the idea and said that he would do anything to learn magic, so Alfred asked him to keep it a secret between them and that they would start their training tomorrow. Phil wondered why he asked him to keep it a secret, so Alfred told him that when people know that he is good at magic, it may lead to a dispute in the succession to the throne, and some may think that he is worthy of taking over the kingdom in the future. So Phil told him that this is impossible as he is the 8th son in his family. Alfred sat down and told him that magic has more power than he thinks, and that he could become the rightful heir and the next ruler, but it is dangerous for a child like him, and it is better to keep it a secret for now. Afterward, Phil returned home and sat down to eat lunch with his family, which consisted of soup in a small cup, and sat looking around and thinking about Alfred's words that he might become the ruler of the kingdom one day and become wealthy. The next day, Phil began his first training with Alfred and told him that they would be practicing amplitude matching, where a magician can match his mana amplitude with another magician who has a larger amplitude, making their amplitude the same size. He then held Phil's hand and asked him to visualize the mana distributed over their bodies. When Phil did so, he was surprised to see Alfred's mana. Alfred told him that a wizard's maximum mana capacity is set at birth and cannot be increased, but he was able to match and surpass it. In the meantime, Phil's father entered the library and wondered when he saw that the crystal had been moved. Then he remembered that he had seen Phil in the library yesterday and laughed when he thought that he was trying to discover his magical abilities. On the other hand, Phil managed to use fire and wind magic over time and was able to destroy many rocks. Then Alfred approached him and praised his ability to learn quickly and that he was able to cast some spells. Phil felt grateful to him and told him that he would not have been able to use the basics of magic if he had practiced on his own. Then he noticed that Alfred was carrying a basket, and Alfred told him that he had brought him food and vegetables, as he was supposed to go out to look for food according to his family's knowledge. When he got home, his family was happy that they could eat a lot of ingredients in their dinner tonight thanks to his talent for gathering mountain vegetables, while Kurt was furious at their praise of Phil. Phil was surprised when his father asked him about getting a vegetable that supposedly grows on the other side of the river with no bridge to cross, and asked him if he used magic to fly. It turns out he was just making fun of him, and everyone laughed at his father's joke while Kurt thought about it seriously. Phil practiced magic under Alfred until he learned how to fly and catch birds using wind magic, and they sat down to eat together near a waterfall. Then Alfred advised him not to go too deep into the forest because it is home to many monsters, and it is also a coveted place for some people looking to get rich quick. After that, Phil told him that he feels that Kurt has been watching him lately, and Alfred thought that he may have realized his ability to use magic and is afraid of losing his succession rights. Phil said that he does not feel like taking over the government because it seems troublesome, especially since it will cause trouble between him and his brother. Alfred suggested he become an adventurer since he has the ability to adapt to his surroundings, and Phil felt it seemed like a good and exciting idea to explore the world around him, and suddenly Alfred's arm had a strange power and he was trying to suppress it inside him while Phil didn't notice it. In the evening, Phil tells his father that he wants to become an adventurer and enroll in the Adventurers Academy when he turns 12. Kurt is relieved that he will get rid of him and won't be a hindrance, but his father tells Phil that they don't have the money to enroll him in the academy, which makes him nervous. The next day, Alfred tells him that the Adventurers Academy academy is located in the city of Brightburg, which is mainly a trading city and allows children to sell what they collect there. So Phil thinks about raising the money to enroll in the academy through trade. Alfred told him that he should learn wandering magic because Brightburg was too far away. He grabbed his arm and began to fly until they reached the highest altitude, and Alfred told him that this was the big world ahead of him. In the evening, Alfred continued to suffer because of his invisible force that restrained him and stifled his breath, but he managed to suppress it in the end, and a few days later, when he was supervising Phil's training, he told him that the last day of training would be tomorrow. He was surprised that the training would end abruptly while he was still learning the magic of flight. Alfred told him that he would be fine as long as he understood the basics, and Phil was worried that he still couldn't control his magic very efficiently. When he sat down to dinner with his family, Phil's father told him that he had heard that a whispering dead had been spotted in the woods, an undead that had regained its cognitive powers, beings not unlike humans in appearance. Phil is surprised when he realizes that Alfred fits all the descriptions his father had given him, with pale skin and a cold body. It seems I was right to be afraid of him when I first saw him. Then his father continued that these creatures become zombies after a few years and aim to hunt humans to eat them. Phil got worried about Alfred and went to the forest, and when he saw him, he told him about the whispering dead and asked him to go home together. Alfred told him that what he says is not true, as he is the whispering dead himself, but Phil refused to believe it and insisted on taking him with him to the mansion. But Alfred told him that he is indeed the whispering dead and told him that it happened 5 years ago when the Duke's son contracted a rare disease, and then the Duke went with him to the enchanted forest in search of a cure for his son, and they had to face monsters that outnumbered them. But then Alfred used up all his mana and was defeated, which caused him to die, but he turned into a whispering dead because of the regret he felt inside. Then he told Phil that a whispering dead person dies when his wish is fulfilled, and his wish was to meet someone who could pass on his magic that he had learned over 30 years. Then Alfred said that he had to lie when he first met him and did not tell him that he was a whispering dead so that he would not be afraid of him and run away. Then he asked him to take one last test to make sure that he was the person he was looking for, and told him that he would teach him the sacred magic of cleansing the living dead. To Phil's surprise, he asks him to destroy him using magic, and Alfred tells him that they have no choice but to do so because he won't be able to maintain his form for long with mana, and he doesn't want to lose his mind and become a zombie. He then told Phil that sacred magic is like the life force of beings and asked him to visualize the life force using mana, and then grabbed his hand, and Phil started using his abilities until Alfred started to feel the effect, but Phil was feeling the unwillingness to destroy his mentor inside him, so Alfred told him to concentrate more and remember what he learned in 2 weeks and finish it. Phil decided to be brave and put his teacher out of his suffering as a kind of payback, and used his imagination and magical ability to erase him from existence, but he cried as he saw him fade away little by little in front of him until he disappeared completely, and vowed to apply everything he learned from his teacher and become a great magician. 7 years later, Phil was 12 years old and left his family's poor mansion and headed to the Adventurers Academy in the city of Brightburg and succeeded in enrolling in it. And when he sat in the classroom among his classmates, he kept thinking about everything he went through after Alfred left and had to isolate from everyone to avoid getting involved in succession issues, which affected his skills in communicating with others despite his strong desire to have friends. It was then his turn to introduce himself to the students, and when he did so, the students were surprised that he didn't mention any of his skills and only mentioned his name, while they all had some combat skills that would qualify them to become adventurers in the future. Phil was frustrated by his classmates' looks and thought he had gone too far by announcing his last name. Then the teacher handed out forms to them, and Phil was surprised when he realized it was a platoon registration form. The teacher told them that from next month they would start training in platoons and that they should form groups together known as platoons. Afterward, Phil sat eating lunch in the food court, alone and feeling like an outcast, while a girl named Lena and her friend Luca talked about him. Luca told her that she had heard about his magical abilities that could match high-level adventurers. Then a boy named Erwin joined them and told them that the magic teacher decided there was nothing Phil needed to learn and gave up teaching him, and suggested they join his team, thinking that he always sits alone and evaluates the students around him. Luca thought it sounded like a good idea. At that time, Phil decided to gather his courage and try to socialize with his classmates. Then he stood up and offered to try his mountain pepper powder on their food, but he was interrupted by the sound of a student's laughter as he addressed Luca and her companions and told them that whatever they were after, his team would be the winning team in the end, and Phil felt that his classmates seemed to be having fun and there was no need to try to disturb them. Afterward, they returned to class on class time, and the teacher suggested that students who didn't have a monthly allowance from their families could work as fishermen for the academy to earn money, and advised those who wanted to work to go in groups with their friends. Lena and her friends were reluctant to go and talk to him to convince him to join them, but Erwin told them that he might want to challenge everyone to hunt alone and that they should compete with him to get his attention. It's simpler than that, Erwin. A few days later, all the students went to the registrar's office to hand over to the academy what they had collected and hunted from the forest in exchange for money. Lena's team managed to catch 3 pigs, and then they were surprised to see Phil heading towards the supervisor without any prey in his possession, while Phil gave him a magical bag that Alfred had entrusted to him before his departure. Then everyone was shocked when Phil took out many prey animals from his bag and placed them in front of the supervisor. One of the students decided to give up the idea of convincing him to join his team due to the huge difference between his level and theirs, and everyone began to leave the office. Then the supervisor gave Phil a large financial reward, and he was happy that he had a lot of money, and he thought about offering his colleagues to have dinner at his expense. But he was surprised when he turned around and found that everyone had already left. In the evening, Erwin sat with Lena and Luca and told them that his brother had already told him that he would not inherit his family's rule, no matter how hard he practiced with his sword, because he was the 5th son of his family. Lena told him that it was the same for them too, but Luca said that they were born with a little more magical power than ordinary people, but they were unable to use it. She then said that without realizing it, she had become stronger than her father and brother, so they shunned her, so she decided to train in secret. Lena was furious and decided to hunt more prey next time so that Phil would recognize them, not knowing that it's simpler than that and that he wishes he had one friend by his side. In the morning, the friends head into the forest in search of bigger prey and are forced to go deeper into the forest despite the teacher's warning that it's dangerous until Lena hears wolves nearby. Meanwhile, Phil was standing at the top of the hill, sensing his surroundings through his magical ability, when he saw a group of people surrounded by wolves and decided to go to help them when he realized that they might be his classmates at the academy and that he would succeed in winning their favor. The wolves started attacking the guys, and they were able to stop some of them until one of the wolves suddenly tried to attack Luca, and Erwin tried to protect her, injuring his arm, and when the wolves approached them to eat them, Phil saved them just in time by forming a barrier of rocks around them using his abilities. Erwin tells Phil that they had to do it to get him to recognize them, and Phil wonders what they meant to him, that they were trying to get him to join their team. I told you guys it was simpler than that. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the teacher, who was surprised by Erwin's injury, who explained that it was just a minor scratch. The teacher then told them that the scholarship class had been invited to attend a party organized and hosted by the Duke of Blycreater. After that, the rest of the class gathered and were very excited to attend the party to take the opportunity to meet the Duke in person, but one of the students thought that the Duke had invited them to get to know the only magician in their class, Phil, and told them that they were just a collector, which led to some students feeling frustrated and others infuriated. Luca shrugged it off and suggested to her friends that they go buy some new clothes for the party, but they resisted the idea, preferring to go in normal clothes and not overdo it. A few days later, a large number of society's elite attended Duke Blycreater's party, and everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves until one of his followers whispered to him that Phil had arrived at the party and the Duke headed towards him, and Luca was confused by his approach, but he ignored everyone and went towards Phil and introduced himself as Amadeus and said he was glad to see him at the party today since his family members rarely participate in gatherings. On the other side, everyone was frustrated and disappointed that the Duke ignored them. Then the Duke asked Phil to speak privately, so he asked him to allow him to bring some people with him, and Erwin, Lena, and Luca were surprised that he meant them and described them as members of his team. After that, they all headed inside the palace, and Amadeus introduced them to his court magician named Branta, and Phil was surprised to learn that he is Alfred's mentor, and Brantad told him the story of his death and that he continued to track Alfred even after he became dead in a whisper. Then Amadeus told him that Branta can track the magical power of anyone he meets for great distances. Then Branta continued that Alfred told him about his wish, and Branta thought that it would never come true since he was ranked as one of the 5 most powerful magicians on the continent, and there is no way he could find a magician who could be recognized as his student until he suddenly disappeared from existence 7 years ago. Then Branta concluded that the magician recognized by Alfred is Phil since he carries his magic bag and comes from the same area where he disappeared after his disappearance. Amadeus wondered if Phil had stolen it, and Brantad told him that no one could use it unless Alfred had transferred ownership to him. Phil replied that he was indeed his student and that he had cleansed him before he became a zombie, so Brantad thanked him for letting Alfred go peacefully. Then Phil told them that his magic bag contained supplies from the 2,000 soldiers who fought the enchanted forest battle against the monsters. Afterward, Lucas sat down to discuss with her friends that Phil had chosen to live alone to avoid the succession struggle and regretted their prejudgment that he was living in a different world. Phil then joined them after handing the Duke and Brantad the supplies. Lena told him that they didn't deserve to be on the same team as him, and Erwin said they were just trying to use him to get stronger and improve their lives. Phil told them that he had done the same thing with them, that he had brought them with him to meet the Duke for fear of going anywhere alone with someone of his stature, and that he wanted to be on the same team with them because he felt it would be fun, even if things got ugly. They all burst out laughing at why Phil wanted to join their team and that he just wanted to make some friends. The Duke interrupts their conversation and tells Phil that he will give him 20% of the value of the supplies as a reward, and they are all surprised to learn learn that the supply reward is worth 1,000 gold pieces and that he will also get Alfred's private property. A few months later, Phil travels to the wedding of his brother Eric in the capital with his friends, and Luca chooses to wear an elegant outfit to the wedding and attract the attention of the nobles. Lena asks if there will be nobles in the audience, and he tells them that he married into an equestrian family and there might be a few of them. Brenta tried to calm him down and told him that a magical ship cannot fall from the sky. Then they were surprised by the appearance of a huge black cloud in the sky, and Branta told them that they could fall from the sky if the ship was attacked by a huge dragon. Then the dragon appeared from inside the black cloud. All the passengers were horrified to see a dragon flying around and thought that the ship was not supposed to pass through the monster-inhabited lands, but one of the crew tried to calm them down and told them that it was just an undead version of the dragon and that Brantag would take care of it. Meanwhile, Branta was talking to the captain and his lieutenants and told them that he would not be able to defeat the dragon because he is a dead whisperer and the only way to defeat him is to purify him with holy magic. But there is another magician who can do it. When Phil found everyone looking at him, he told them that there was no way he could do it. Branta tried to encourage him and told him that Alfred would have taken care of him easily. Phil felt that he had to save everyone and agreed to face the dragon. Branta told him that he would protect the ship until he finished cleansing it. Then he opened the back door of the ship and Phil flew towards the dragon, which attacked as soon as it saw him, but he managed to block it by forming a magical barrier around himself. When he turned behind him, he found Branta protecting the ship with a magical barrier, so Phil decided not to waste time and kill the dragon quickly, but the dragon continued to attack him, so he moved away from him a safe distance until he succeeded in creating the holy light and then fired it at the dragon with all his strength and succeeded in defeating it despite its attempt to resist the cleansing ability, but it gradually began to disappear until it disappeared. Branta then drew his attention to using the magic bag to collect his bones, and when Phil collected them, he noticed a red gemstone hovering among the bones. After that, everyone celebrated being safe after Phil's success in defeating the dragon. Then Phil and Branta met a man named Arterio who admired Phil's abilities, and Branta told him that Arterio was one of his partners when he was an adventurer, but now he is the head of a trading company in the capital. The next morning, the ship arrived in the capital city of Statenburg, and that was the first time Phil saw it for real. When they got off the ship, Erwin suggested that they go for a tour around the capital. Then Branta left under the pretext that he had some commitments and asked Arterio to take care of them. Arterio thought he had run away, and Phil wondered what he was saying until they saw a group of knights gathering in front of them. Then one of them dismounted from his horse and approached them and knelt down to praise Phil's defeat of the dragon and told him that the king was waiting for him in the castle and invited him to ride in his carriage. After they arrived at the castle, Phil stood amazed at its size, and his friends told him that they were heading to his brother's wedding, and he was surprised that they would leave him alone with Arterio. And when he entered the castle, he found the king sitting on his throne waiting for him with some personalities, so Phil approached him confused. When he stood in front of the king next to Arterio, he imitated what he was doing and knelt down to greet the king, and when he saw the king up close, his mouth remained empty, not realizing what was happening around him. Then the king told him that he would give him the 6th rank of the baronet as a reward. When Arterio found him looking like a mummified statue, he asked him to recite the oath he had taught him before they entered the castle, and he swore to use his sword for the sake of the kingdom and its people, and the king told him that he would give him the twin dragon medal. At that time, the friends were sitting in Eric's house with Branta, and Branta told them that Phil would be given at least the rank of baronet as a reward for his achievement. Eric expressed his happiness at the position Phil had reached and then wondered if this rank would create a separate bloodline within their family. Lena worried that Phil would stop being an adventurer and leave them, but Branta told them that he would only become a nobleman in robes without owning land in the capital. After that, Phil handed over the dragon bones, the stones he had collected in the magic bag, and the huge red stone, and one of the leaders and officials debated the price they should give Phil for his efforts until an old man named Cardinal Huenheim intervened and suggested that they give him 150,000 gold pieces and not embarrass themselves further in front of Phil. Arterio felt that they were trying to curry favor with Phil, while Huenheim was trying to recruit him to the church. Marshal Egger was trying to use him in his efforts to strengthen the army, and Commissioner Rockner was focused on reducing the amount of money they would give him, and Phil felt pressured by this new situation. In the evening, Phil left the castle with Arterio, and someone tried to impress Phil with his acrobatic skills, and he thought he might be a street performer, but Arterio told him that he only hoped to hire him as his guard, and Phil was surprised by his words, but Arterio told him that he is now a noble with a promising future after gaining the twin dragon medal, which no one has had for more than 2 centuries, making him the focus of everyone's attention to try to take advantage of him. The next day, Eric's wedding preparations begin, and Phil arrives with his friends to introduce them to his brothers, but he notices that their faces are frowning, and Eric tells him that they haven't received a wedding gift from their family yet, and everyone will think that their family is being rude. Then Carl gave him a letter from Kurt, but he felt that it was written by his wife, and in the letter he asked them to pay for the gift for him and Paul because he is broke, and they felt indignant about it since they are not as rich as he thinks they are. Phil suggested that they give them a bouquet of flowers, but Paul told him that they had to buy an expensive and valuable gift that reflected their status, and that they could not ask the Duke for a loan because they would not be able to repay it. Phil felt that his brothers were in trouble and decided to take the initiative and pay them money and bring gifts, and then everyone celebrated the wedding of Eric and his wife, and Phil felt that being a nobleman was a troublesome thing. After the wedding was over, Phil sat alone and sighed until Arterio joined him and asked him to cheer up a bit, then gave him the kumikoji that Phil had asked him to get for him after asking a merchant for it because it was not available, and Phil was delighted to find it. After that, Phil invited his friends to the kitchen, and they prepared food together using the kumikoji that will help ferment it, and after they put the food in the pot, Phil used his magical ability to speed up its fermentation instead of waiting a whole year and succeeded in cooking miso, and he sat down to eat it with his friends, brother and wife, feeling happy in his new life with his family. The next day, Huanhin invited the noble magician Phil to participate in the church baptism. Phil expressed his gratitude for the invitation and gave him a modest gift. They sat and chatted until Huanhin's granddaughter joined them to serve the tea and introduced herself as Eliza, Huanhin's granddaughter. When Phil stared at her for a long time, Huanhin realized that he had noticed her magical power and told him that she knew how to use healing magic to heal the wounded, that there were many nuns in the church who did charity work, and that he wanted his granddaughter to marry like a normal girl. Phil said she was a beautiful girl and there would be competition for her. He joked that he might want to participate. Huanhin asked if he wanted to marry her already. He said it would only be an engagement because he was still a minor. Huanhin then suggested that they have a proper wedding when they came of age since Eliza was 12 years old, and Phil was surprised that he agreed immediately and finalized his engagement to her even though he had only met her for 1 minute. After his departure, Huanhin felt that he may have been too pushy about his granddaughter's engagement, but he felt that things were going well because he had the king's support and no one could oppose the marriage, neither the Duke nor Phil's family. In the meantime, Phil was sitting in his room, dressed as a clown, which speaks volumes about him now that he had accepted the invitation to attend the christening and returned engaged to Huanhin's granddaughter. When he told his friends, Lucas said she seemed perfect because she had a good pedigree and character, but he wondered if 1 minute was enough time to choose his lifelong partner. Eric told him that he and his brothers had never met their wives before the wedding, and Phil was disappointed that there were no romantic love marriages among the nobles. After Eric and his wife helped him disguise himself as a complete clown so that he could go out and shop in the capital without anyone recognizing him, he went to a store with Erwin, and everyone looked at him strangely and disgusted, not knowing that this clown is a role model in our world. Then Erwin suggested he buy a souvenir for his wife and have a good time walking around. After that, they kept walking until Phil noticed the guy again with the stuntman with the gun. As soon as he looked at him, Phil panicked that he might be caught, but Erwin told him that he wouldn't recognize him in disguise, but he was shocked when the guy approached him and called him by his last name, said he was dressed funny for him, but he could recognize him by his teeth. Damn, that chatty bastard has a strong intuition. Maybe Phil should give him a chance. Phil tells him to keep his voice down before anyone else recognizes him, but unfortunately it's too late. Everyone recognizes him, and the knights start asking to be taken as followers. When he realizes he's surrounded on all sides, he uses his teleportation ability to escape with Erwin. After that, they return to the palace, and he felt distressed because he was restricted and could not roam freely because of his fame. So Eric suggested that he appoint a follower to reject all those who try to become his follower, and the idea came to him to make Erwin a follower to do this task, and then quickly exited the room. That idiot did not watch the anime Attack on Titan before leaving his original world. How could he want someone named Erwin to become his follower? Phil then used his teleportation ability and headed towards the church, but he was surprised to appear right in front of Huanhim's window, but he fell before he saw him, and after Huanhim heard a crashing sound outside, he approached the window to check the situation, but he saw nothing. Phil sighed with relief, but panicked when he heard Eliz behind him, so he quickly pulled her back before she caught her grandfather's attention, then told her that he came after buying something to eat together, but he was surprised that the cake was completely destroyed, so he realized the situation and told her that he came to talk to her a little. They sat on the roof of the church to talk about their engagement in the morning, and Phil was curious about how she felt about it. Eliz simply replied that it felt good that her grandfather had chosen to get engaged to the Dragon Slayer Baronet, and that she was happy about it. Meanwhile, Lena and Luca were surprised that Erwin had hired Phil as a follower after they returned from shopping, and Luca wanted him to hire them as a follower as well. Erwin used his power and told them to forget about it, and infuriated them when he sarcastically said that he would recommend them to Phil when he returned. Lena whispered to her and felt that Erwin would treat them as his inferiors if they joined him, and began to think of an idea to become superior to him. Then Eric and his wife entered the room and asked for someone to help them with the cooking, and Erwin volunteered for the task. When Luca turned to them, she had the idea that she and Lena could become his wives to be above Erwin to Phil, sharing his caring right. But Lena remembered that Eliz is the most likely candidate to be his wife, so Luca changed the plan to aim to become his his maids, and Lena found that it might be a good idea. And when Phil returned, Luca decided to start seducing him to accept them as his maids, and went to him and started dancing in a pathetic and unattractive way. And as soon as Phil heard that dinner was ready, he ignored her shameful offer and went out to eat dinner. Luca decides to go with plan B. She shortens her dress a little so that she can seduce him more. Lena feels in high spirits since she won't be able to chase him this way. Luca tells her that her goal is to become his maid, set up a school to teach her magic, and get her family to recognize her. Lena felt a little more confident and thought she'd give it a try too. Meanwhile, Phil was listening to their noises as he stood outside the mansion and received an invitation envelope from Huenheim's servant to have dinner with Ellis tomorrow night. The next day at dinner time, Phil and Eliz sit down to dinner privately under the watchful eye of the butler, but they have nothing to talk about all day, even though it's supposed to be their first date. Phil feels like leaving after dinner, but the butler suggests he give her something to commemorate their first date with coral fish. Shh, I hate all seafood. Afterward, he goes with them to a store to buy her an engagement ring and finds that one of the rings costs from 10 to 50 gold pieces, which is 1 to 5 million yen in Japan. Eliza approaches him and tells him that he shouldn't buy something so expensive. She seems right. He can pay that amount to Togashi to complete the Hunter manga. But he tells her that he got a generous reward after killing the dragon and collecting its bones, and does not think about money much. Then he noticed that there is a ring in which part of the huge red stone was placed, so he decided to buy it for her to look special. But he was shocked when the seller told him that the price was 300 gold pieces, equivalent to 300 million yen, but he decided to buy it in the end, and Ellis kept looking at him in amazement. On their way back, she tells him that according to the salesman, this ring can store great magical power as it is made of magical stones, and she feels that he bought it for her to wear and can use it at some point in the future. Phil denied this and said that he bought it when he thought it would look good on her and didn't know it was made of a magical stone. He then told her that he used to feel stressed when someone called him a hero or a dragon slayer until he met her and learned that she was called a saint, which relieved him a little. Then he wanted to try the ring, where the seller told them that it would shine if he used magic on it. And as soon as he did so, a great force came out towards the roof of the carriage as if it opened a portal to another world above them, and Phil remained watching the sight in amazement. You may find such sights in Fortnite, my friend. Afterward, Huenheim asks his servant what he thinks of Phil, and he tells him that he is a difficult boy to understand as he treats Ellis differently, as if she were a normal girl and not the saint that everyone knows, and he cannot guess what exactly is going on in his head. The next day, Erwin wonders about Lena and Luca's plan to become Phil's servants, and Luca tells him that they will resume their seduction attempts after they return to Praechburg. But they are surprised when Ellis comes to the castle, and Eric tells them that she came to see Phil, and then Eliz feels a little embarrassed and tells them that she wanted to ask them about his personality and what kind of boy he is. Meanwhile, Phil was at the castle to meet the king with Brantok and was surprised when the king asked him to slay a dragon. Phil had to accept the task against his will and felt as if he had become a slave to the king. One of the king's knights explains the area where the dragon lives and that the kingdom will be able to solve the food shortage in the capital. They develop the area and get rid of the dragon. Phil is surprised when he realizes that only he and Brantok will be able to carry out the task. Then a large man named Armstrong enters the room, seemingly very excited to share the task with them, and Phil is surprised when he tells the king that they will go immediately to carry out the task. They flew out of the castle and started to fly towards the intended area. Armstrong took the role of leader and told them that they would first go to the military zone on the border to develop a plan of attack and make the necessary preparations. A few days later, Eric told Phil's friends that he received a message from the palace that Phil would be staying longer than expected to exterminate the monsters in the area after getting rid of the dragon because they might attack the capital in the future. Lena wondered how a nobleman could not have an actual army, so he told them that the king chose Phil because he is a nobleman in robes, which means he does not own land, and when he succeeds in the mission, he will be honored with money and medals, and they will not have to give him part of the vast lands. Then they were interrupted by Rodrigue's voice outside the palace gate in the crowd, still doing his acrobatics, and Luca realized that they had all come to join Phil's army. So Eric asked Erwin to take over as Phil's subordinate, but he was worried about taking on the sudden responsibility of being the leader. So Eric told him that he would help him and that he would replace him in name only. The friends then formed a makeshift army for Phil and headed towards the wilderness area. At night, halfway through the journey, they set up tents and stayed there until morning, with Erwin feeling the excitement of the first battle of their lives together. When she asked where Phil was, they told her that he was camping near the dragon's lair to attack it at dawn. After that, Phil went to the dragon's lair at dawn with Brantog and Armstrong and was surprised when the dragon came out of its lair and saw its enormous size, while Armstrong summoned his armored clothes and his iron hammer to prepare to face it and then began to attack it with several blows. To Phil's surprise, he uses a type of magic capable of transforming magical power into physical forms, in addition to his tremendous defensive strength that enables him to face the dragon alone. The dragon tried to return to its lair and hide inside it, but Armstrong caught up with him and grabbed its tail before it escaped. Phil begins to prepare his magical powers, unsure if Armstrong really needs them. Brantat tells him that his magical armor consumes power so quickly that he won't last long in a fight. When the time is right, Armstrong orders him to strike the final blow. He uses his magic power and attacks the dragon. But on the other side, Liz is having breakfast with friends when a soldier interrupts and informs them that Phil and the others have defeated the dragon. Phil put the dragon in his magic bag after defeating it, even though they didn't get a reward for it. Brantat told him that he could make money selling the dragon's parts and it would be worth more than any reward. Then Armstrong told him that the real trouble was just beginning and it was time to get ready to do the hard work. But Phil thought there was nothing harder or scarier than a dragon. So Brantat shocked him with the news that they would face countless monsters and he would experience what Alfred would feel like in the Battle of the Enchanted Forest. In the meantime, Eliz was treating some of the injured after the soldiers joined Phil and the others to exterminate the monsters, and they were unaware of the huge number of them. And as time passed, the number of injured inside the priest's tents increased, and Eliz took care of them until her magical power ran out. Then she remembered about her ring, which contains a stone that can store a large amount of magical power. In the evening, Eliz sat down, feeling exhausted from treating so many wounded. Then one of the soldiers approached her, admiring Phil's abilities and telling her that they had managed to survive until now thanks to him. She remembered when they were in the carriage and Phil mentioned that he felt pressured whenever someone called him a hero or a dragon slayer and that he thought he was unworthy. So she decided to put more effort into treating the wounded so that his sacrifice would not be in vain, and she took care of them until the next morning. Then they received news that the monster extermination forces were returning from the front after their victory and the success of the mission. But Eliz was surprised to learn that Phil was injured during the battle, and she rushed towards him, exhausted, but she was surprised that the injured was one of his brothers while he was standing behind her, and he was not seriously injured, and she fainted from fatigue and worry about him. After that, she regained consciousness and found herself lying under the shade of a large tree and next to Phil, who told her that he had heard about her saving many lives in medical tents and admired her efforts in treating others, and said some phrases that he had heard from the soldiers. They were then surprised when Armstrong broke into their cell and rushed over to Eliza to check on her after realizing that she was his niece, and Phil was shocked when Brantat confirmed the information to him. After they returned, Phil was surprised that someone had painted a portrait of him after his promotion and second medal, then asked Erwin to get the rest of the luggage to prepare to leave Eric's palace, as they will stay in the capital by order of Duke Amadios to continue training. Then Luca thought that in this case Phil and Eliz will live together and the seduction plan will be difficult to implement, but they were surprised when Eliz said that she thought he was engaged to one or both of them since they lived together. Phil denied it and then asked her if she supported the idea of concubines, and then Lena and Luca felt it was the right opportunity to become his concubines and asked to marry him and Eliz, and Phil did not mind that when he took her consent to the matter. He married 3 girls by pure coincidence so far. A few months later, Phil goes to his brother Hamlet's wedding to an equestrian girl, and one of his brothers tells him that the reason families want to marry them is so they can become his relatives. Phil feels ashamed and says there might be another reason, but his brother tells him that he has to accept that he's a big deal in the community and that he has to make a decision about the upcoming pageant. Phil was surprised when his brother mentioned a competition. Eric said it was a martial arts competition held by the kingdom every 3 years, and he was expected to participate in it. Phil thought about joining the mage division, but was surprised when Eric told him that the competition has only 4 divisions: swordsmanship, archery, and hand-to-hand combat. His brother suggested him to join the swordsman division to show everyone his excellent abilities in using the sword as a noble, so Phil decided that he would enhance his body with magic, but Eric told him that the use of magic is prohibited in this competition, so he felt frustrated and wished there was a division for a cooking competition. Erwin was practicing with Lena and Luca, but he quickly ran out of energy and felt that it was because of the way they had been training for the past 6 months, and he was unable to keep up with them. They then noticed Phil catching up with them, heading to the church to meet Huanheim. When they got home, they were surprised when Brantat asked them to participate in the competition as Phil's followers, and that all they had to do was qualify for the preliminary rounds, but Lena and Luca felt that it was almost impossible without using magic, but Brantat told them that they would shame Phil if they lost in the first round, so they gathered their courage and decided to start training without magic. Erwin thought he had nothing to lose even if he lost the competition, so Brantat asked him if he thought he would be separated from his team. Brantat said that they would all come of age when they turned 15 in 2 years, so they would become official adventurers, and it was natural to get rid of those who didn't work hard before that. Erwin told him that they were connected to their souls and it couldn't happen, but Brantat told him not to be naive, then told him that he had changed his team members a few times in the past and asked him to be careful not to be a hindrance to his comrades, which made Erwin feel anxious. In the evening, they all sat down to dinner and Lena asked if Phil was going to participate in the martial arts competition. He said that he had been gathering information about it and heard that the winner of the last 2 editions, a royal knight named Varen, was withdrawn withdrawing from the competition this year to help train the next generation, which would make the competition easier. Then he was a little confused before he asked them to talk about their adventure team. Erwin was nervous, then Phil told them that he met Human Him today because of that, and that he decided to include Eliz in their team. Erwin sighed with relief that he wouldn't be kicked off the team, and everyone welcomed her with open arms. Phil was relieved that his friends welcomed her, and that he could now focus on the competition, but they were surprised by Erwin's sudden enthusiasm and his statement that he would make sure to win the competition, and then he started putting more effort than usual in his training. So Phil couldn't keep up with him and kept getting overly excited about the competition and vowing to win it, thinking he was Erwin Smith. Phil, meanwhile, was so bad at everything except magic that he couldn't even swing a sword, and his physical fitness was zero compared to his friends. In the evening, he returned home and lay down on the couch while the others continued practicing, with Eliz watching them from the window. The next day, Erwin noticed that his hand was bleeding from swinging the sword and practicing with it, but his friends believed that he would do well in the competition, and then everyone was surprised when the king ordered Varen to participate in the competition to help shape the next generation by becoming an obstacle for them to defeat. Disappointed, Erwin went to his room and lay on his bed in despair. Luca asked him if he was going to give up just because he knew Varen was participating, and he told them that he had seen many of his amazing fights and that it was no wonder he was the leader of the royal knights. Lena tried to encourage him and told him that they don't consider him an obstacle, but he said that no one who is born with magic can feel it, so they let him have some time alone. The next day, Erwin went to the lobby and found Phil sitting alone. So he approached him and asked him if he was going to kick him off the team if he couldn't win any games in the competition. But he was surprised that Phil was asleep on the couch, and when he woke him up, he thought it was Eliz until he saw him standing next to him. Phil said that Eliz was worried about joining their team. Erwin said that he thought she would be a great help to them with her healing magic, but Phil told him that she was worried about her physical abilities as she did not train like them and feared that she would become a burden to them one day, so she started practicing every day on her own. Then he asked Erwin what he wanted to ask him, and Erwin felt some confidence from his speech and told him that he wanted to tell him to make sure to watch and win the competition. Then he went outside to meet Lena and Luca to apologize for what he said yesterday, and their response was that they would make an effort to win the competition. Then they continued their training, so he felt confident and joined them in training. A few days later, it was time for the start of the competition, and everyone started warming up for the matches while Phil was standing against the wall and falling asleep. Armstrong hoped that they would succeed in qualifying from the preliminary rounds. Then Eliza joined them and gave them a lunchbox that she made herself for them. Then Phil's head hit the wall and he woke up from the pain and realized that it was time for his fight. So he went to the ring and was surprised that the first opponent he would face was Varen himself. He thought then that he might be in trouble to face Varen in his first fight, but he decided to fight with all his strength and not think about winning or losing too much. But he was shocked that as soon as he rang the starting bell, Varen rushed towards him and hit him with the hilt of the sword in his stomach and managed to defeat him in one fell swoop. Afterward, Brantag and Armstrong were frustrated that they'd lost the champ a second and a half into the fight and hoped they wouldn't have to bring his friends back so soon. Phil, with confidence on his ridiculous face, told them they'd do just fine, as if he was an expert in such matches. Meanwhile, Erwin and the others were doing their best in their fights against their opponents, winning their first matches in all divisions. After a while, a frustrated Luca returned and told them that she had been eliminated in the semifinals of the preliminary rounds, and Brant had told her that she had done well despite not using magic. Of course, any participant would do well if he didn't lose his fight in a second and a half, as well as the clumsy one. On the other hand, Lena made it to the final in the archery division and thought she'd advance from the prelims if she could win, but she was surprised to find herself facing Rodrigue, the famous acrobat. Lena was amazed at his defense. Then Rodrigue attacked her with several quick strikes, but she was able to block his blows, and as soon as she attacked him, she was surprised that he blocked her with one move, then made a surprise attack and managed to make her throw her spear away. After that, Lena returned with her head down after her defeat against Rodrigue and told them that he is not just a street performer, but that he grew up in a family of merchants, and kept talking about the information she gathered about him. But she noticed that Phil did not listen to any of what she said because he is asleep as usual. I do not know how Alfred decided to consider this scum to be his successor at 2.5 years old. In the meantime, Erwin managed to win his matches and reach the final of the swordsman division, but he felt a sudden pain in his arm, and when he turned around, he found Varen approaching him to tell him that he was looking forward to facing them in the final. After he returned to his room, the tournament director advised him to withdraw if he was unable to continue the fight due to the injury, but he refused and insisted on continuing the fight because he vowed to win, as it was his only hope to keep his place on Team Phil. Then Luca told him that he had stayed up late last night to prepare their lunch boxes, and when Erwin opened his box, he found that he had prepared food and made miniature figures of them in an attempt to encourage them. Erwin feels confident and belongs to his team and eats some food from his box. He decides to keep fighting, not to run away or Phil will be ridiculed, and to dedicate his soul to the fight against the giants, Varen. After the end of the competition, Erwin and Lena started training under Varen and the Spear Commander, and Phil felt happy for them because they are training under prestigious leaders. Then Luca told him about her teacher's offer to train them together, so Phil decided that they would all use the next 2 years to train and develop until they become official adventurers. Then he asked her who would be their training supervisor and was surprised that Armstrong fell from the sky on them and that he would train them for 2 years from now. 3 years later, Kurt was helping his father plow and cultivate the land when his wife came with their young children and told him that a visitor was waiting for him at the mansion, and he was furious when he realized that the visitor wanted to talk about his brother Phil. Kurt ignored him, gave the envelope to his wife, and told the visitor that he had nothing to do with Phil. As he was leaving, his wife opened the letter and read it and was shocked to learn that Phil had died while exploring ancient ruins. Phil, on the other hand, had become a young man after a lot of hard training and was ready for his first adventure as an adult. The friends were reading the guild's instructions after they had successfully registered as adventurers, and Lena read that their first task would be to hunt in the local area for a while. Meanwhile, Phil was happy about becoming an adventurer, finally free from the ridiculous obligations of nobility, and no one would be able to take away his freedom. Brenta interrupted their celebration and told them that their team had taken on the task of searching for ancient ruins by order of the king, and Phil realized that nothing had changed. After that, they all headed towards the underground cave with Brenta to guide them, and then he told them that these dungeons were discovered after their army's victory against Gregorland, and then a few people were sent by the Adventurers Guild, but none of them ever returned, which made them suspect a dragon inside the cave, and that's why they were given the mission, and they named their team Dragon Hunters. Well done. Phil marveled that his friends were hiding behind him for fear of the dragon attacking them and not wanting to die on their first mission. Brenta told them that he had cast a detector spell to sense the presence of creatures around them, and when he opened the portal, they approached a circle in the center of it. Erwin felt bored because they had not found anything yet, and Phil wondered about the bodies of the missing adventurers inside the place, and suddenly Brantag ordered them to come out of the room, but before anyone moved, they felt a strange force paralyzing them. He told them that it was a trap set by the ancient civilization of magic, and asked them to prepare to fight at any moment, but he disappeared before he finished his sentence. Then everyone started to disappear gradually until Eliz was left alone, but she soon disappeared and the room was empty. Then they all found themselves in a place called Reverse Hanging, and Brant had told them that it was a trap that teleported victims to the basement by magic and forced them to return to the surface if they didn't want to die. Luca thought it would be easy thanks to Phil's teleportation ability, but was shocked when he told them he couldn't use it since he didn't know where he was right now. They noticed there were stairs behind them, so they decided to try it the old-fashioned way. When they got to the top, they found a dark corridor, and when they crossed it, they found a large group of soldiers standing with swords and armor. Then they were surprised by a door that closed behind them to be locked inside the corridor with the unknown soldiers. Then they gradually began to wake up, and Phil and his friends prepared to face them. Branta then asked Phil and Eliz to support them by using wind magic and healing to limit the movement of the enemies and heal their comrades from any injuries at the same time. Then they all continued to take down the soldiers one by one, testing their combat abilities after hard training, and succeeded in defeating them all. Then Lena was surprised when she found the bodies of the missing adventurers. Then Luca heard the sound of footsteps coming from above and discovered that more enemies were coming towards them, so they decided to run away quickly before they saw them. And in the meantime, the king was sitting with Armstrong, and he was worried that 5 days had passed without any news, especially after hearing rumors about their death. On the other hand, rumors spread in the church about the death of Phil and his friends, but Huenheen was confident that they would return alive soon, and on his way he met Commissioner Rockner, who wondered where the rumors of Phil and his companions came from. In the meantime, Rockner's younger brother was responsible for spreading the rumors, sending a henchman to give Kurt, Phil's older brother, a message about his death to incite him to inherit the estate, hoping for some unknown reason that the rumors would come true. At the time, Phil and his friends were facing the soldiers underground, and he felt that they shouldn't keep fighting and draining their energy for too long, and while Eliz was talking to him, she realized that he had already fallen asleep on her shoulder due to fatigue. This went on for several days until they ran out of energy, and Erwin felt that they might die at this rate and thought that he shouldn't die until he defeated Varen in at least one fight. Eliz told him that she would regret it if they didn't all return home safely. When they entered the portal, there was no one waiting for them, so they thought it was over and were about to leave, but Branta was surprised to find that the dragon was waiting for them and attacked them as soon as he saw them, but he used a magical barrier to block it. Then they were surprised that Lena was injured by an unknown soldier behind them. Then the room suddenly lit up, and they realized that they were in trouble and trapped, with the dragon attacking them on one side and the soldiers on the other, and everyone felt weakened after draining a great deal of their magical and physical energy. Eliz had to use the magic stored in her ring to heal Lena's injuries, while Branta Branta was thinking about acting quickly to prevent the situation from getting worse. Phil thought about crushing the dragon directly, but Branta told him that the dragon's body is made of mithril and will not be affected by magical spells. After thinking about it, Branta approached Phil and told him that he would bet all his magical power on him and put his hands on his shoulders and supplied him with his magical energy, and they managed to resist the dragon's attack for a while. But soon Branta felt weak, and when he looked at Phil, he realized that he looked a lot like Alfred. Phil felt that everyone was in danger, and he had to do his best to save them, so he used his maximum magical power to resist the dragon. Elis decided to help him before his powers ran out, so she approached him and kissed him to use the Light of Miracle spell on him, as if there was no other way to use it. Then Elis fainted after she gave her last bit of energy to him, and Phil was able to block the dragon's attack and counterattack and succeeded in defeating it. After doing so, they discovered that the soldiers had stopped moving after the dragon's death, and when Erwin looked behind him, he found Phil unconscious next to Elis. After a while, Phil regained consciousness and saw Lena and Luca whispering about Noor's miraculous ability and that she didn't necessarily have to kiss him to give him her magical energy, and Luca thought she had used the situation to do so. Then Erwin interrupted them and asked them to follow him to show them something important. After they left, Phil got up and looked at Elis with love. After they regained consciousness and some of their energy, they went to meet Branta, who told them that he found out that the dams were made by Count Eichelberg and guessed that he might want to test the human's abilities. Then they were interrupted by the arrival of Luca, who asked them to come and see the amazing discovery and found that there were old-fashioned airships, which are the essence of today's magical airships. Then Erwin pressed a button, and Phil was surprised to find that it was a small portal to the outside and felt hope and pride in the success of their mission and seeing the sun shine again. After they all returned to the capital, they reported their discoveries inside the hidden cave to the king, and the king decided to buy them all and increase the reward earned by the Adventurers Guild. Then everyone was surprised when Commissioner Rockner mentioned that the reward per person would be 2 million gold pieces to be paid in installments for 20 years. Phil and his friends decide to leave Breakberg and venture elsewhere. Armstrong accepts their decision and vows to find the person who spread rumors about their death. Phil is surprised that everyone thought he was dead, and Armstrong tells him that the price of power and fame is jealousy and envy. Luca was frustrated that the envy would only increase after the news of their huge bonus spread, so Lena suggested that they challenge the large amount of money the syndicate has to pay to minimize their share and avoid harassment, since they are already receiving a lot of money from Phil. When Armstrong asked them where the money they were deducting would be redistributed, they all turned their attention to Phil with the intention of giving him their share of the reward, but he refused and told them that he was satisfied. Lena asked what Eliza intended to do with her prize and said that all her property would go to Phil, and Luca congratulated him for getting 10 million gold coins, and Phil felt that this would be another reason for people to hate him. In the meantime, the officials at the legation were furious that Phil and his friends had survived their mission, and the younger brother Rockner felt that he had benefited from this news in that he knew all of Phil's haters and began to think about getting rid of him. After that, Phil and his companions were having breakfast at the mansion, and he felt as if someone was standing at the window, but he didn't see anyone, so he thought about hiring someone to take care of the mansion after they left the capital, and they all thought that they would need to hire a strong person since Phil is hated by some and must be loyal and protect the mansion. They thought of Rodrigue, who had defeated Lena in the martial arts competition, and felt it was a good idea because he was still passionate about joining Phil, even though he had ignored him for the past 3 years, and Phil was surprised when he realized that he had to take the initiative and go talk to him to bring him on board. They made a birthday cake and went to him to see if he would be interested in joining them and working for Phil. Rodrigue was overjoyed and started crying with joy, and everyone sighed with relief. Phil noticed someone standing on Rodrigue's porch watching them. It was a mysterious girl with pink hair and a hoodie that hid her features, and she kept watching them while they were inside Rodrigue's house. After a while, Luca rushed to the balcony after sensing that someone was watching them. They thought it might be the person who spread the rumors of Phil's death. Rodrigue vowed to find this person no matter what and advised him to leave the city as soon as possible, but Phil thought there was something he wanted to do before leaving. After that, they headed to the Magic Civilization Research Laboratory to meet the head researcher, Lucas Pickenpower, who was happy to see them. Phil asked him if he had a magic circle that could summon whatever the user imagined, and Lucas said that it was still a prototype and would require a great deal of magical power to use it, but it would be able to fulfill his request. Phil walked over to it and stood in the middle of it. Lucas asked him to visualize exactly what he wanted to bring, then he used his imagination to visualize that he was teleporting something to them. An underwear appeared in front of him, and one of the researchers hit him and took the underwear from him. Phil told them that his visualization realization was slightly skewed because Erwin had already mentioned the underwear. Then he made another attempt and concentrated this time, then reimagined the image of the Force again and succeeded in summoning what he wanted. The mysterious girl watched them from behind the trees until Phil used his teleportation ability and they went straight home. She couldn't follow them and kept thinking about what Phil was up to. Meanwhile, Rodri was searching for the source of the rumors and keeping an eye out for some suspicious commissioners until he saw Rockner's younger brother at the window and felt he might be hiding something. The mysterious girl then headed towards Phil's mansion, and when she looked through the window, she saw that they had prepared a big party with many dignitaries in attendance to thank everyone who had helped him during his time in the capital. Phil then brought what he had summoned with the magic circle and told everyone that he had caught a huge tuna fish from the north, and everyone marveled at its size and shape and wondered how to eat it. So he suggested they eat it with the soy sauce he had prepared to enjoy a unique experience. Damn, I feel nauseous here. Then Rodri joined them and spoke to him privately, telling him that the person who spread the rumors of his death was the younger brother Alice Rockner. Phil was surprised by his behavior since he had never met him before and did not know him, but Rodri told him that he was just using him to succeed in removing his older brother from his position. Then he told him about the emissary that Alice had sent to his home in the countryside with the news of his death with the intention of making Kurt's sons inherit his inheritance to gain more power. Phil was furious that his family was involved, but Rodri told him that he had made the necessary arrangements for him. In the evening, Alice learned that he had become the talk of the town after news of his plot to get Phil killed in the Damnet mission spread, and was shocked when his wife entered and told him that a messenger had arrived from the palace with a summons from the king. Rodrigue said that he had spread a false rumor about Alice to answer his rumors, and that if they were caught, they would claim to know nothing about it, and he would not be punished, but only questioned. Phil thanked him for finding the culprit after all. Rodrigue said it was only a suspicion at first because he knew his character. Phil was surprised to learn that Alice Rockner was Rodrigue's father and told him that he did not recognize him as a son since his mother was the daughter of a lowly merchant and could not even be a concubine. Then Eliza joined them, carrying a plate of tuna for Rodrigue, and all this time the mysterious girl was still standing at the window, watching everything that was happening inside until she decided to enter the mansion and knocked hard on the door, and everyone felt that something was wrong. Then the girl destroyed the entrance door, and everyone was surprised to find that she was just a little girl. Then she headed towards Phil and Rodrigue, and when Erwin tried to stop her, she knocked him down with a quick movement. Then she rushed towards them, and Phil thought she was going to attack him, but he was surprised when she grabbed the tuna dish and ate it all. Then Marshal Edgar approached them, and Phil wondered if he knew her. He told him she was his daughter, Velma Italvan, and that he wanted to introduce her to him. Velma told him she'd been investigating him for the last while to see if anyone could feed her enough. She was acting as if he was adopting a pet. Edgar said that food is the most important thing in her life. Branta approached them and told Phil that she has hero syndrome. Edgar said that she needs to compensate for the energy she consumes all the time with food, which makes her very voracious, and the cost of feeding her is very high, so Phil felt he would be forced to adopt the monster while Lena and Luca were happy to meet Velma. Edgar then offered Phil to marry her or take her as his bodyguard. He told him that they intend to return to Brightburg to start hunting missions as ordinary adventurers, and that he will not need a bodyguard with such great strength. Edgar was surprised by his talk about hunting missions and told him that he will exterminate the monsters when he returns to the city. Meanwhile, Phil's family still thought he was dead after the rumors, but they were surprised when they saw him through the window standing outside the house with his team members. As they all sat having tea with his family members, Phil felt nostalgic as he sipped the diluted tea that his poor family still makes, while Branta told them the story of the Battle of the Enchanted Forest and the death of the soldiers who participated in it, and told them that the bodies that fell turned into zombies, and the Duke ordered them to cleanse them before they became worse. Kurt was angered by the Duke's order to send troops to the Enchanted Forest again, so Branta told him that the reason for their visit was to discuss how they would take care of the monsters they were going to kill, and Kurt said that they would have to pay a tribute since the forest was within their borders. Branta asks them to negotiate the tribute rate. Kurt asks Claus, the village trustee, what the normal rate would be, and he says it would be around 30%, so he decides to make it 50% to make them leave the place. Herman tried to persuade him to lower the rate in exchange for the soldiers' weapons and armor, but he said he didn't care about retrieving their remains because they were poor, worthless soldiers, and they had already held funerals for them. So Eliza suggested that she participate in holding other funerals for them after the cleansing process. When Kurt spoke rudely to her, rejecting her suggestion, Erwin felt he couldn't take any more of his arrogance and asked him to stop. Kurt sarcastically called him a barbarian, and Phil tried to resolve the matter by asking his father to begin formal negotiations. Kurt was offended because he meant that the negotiations with him were informal. They told him that they they had come to discuss it with the Baumeister family elder. He also talks rudely all the time. He was furious that his younger brother's followers were talking disrespectfully to him. Afterward, Kurt thought about the random letter Rockner had given him and then held a meeting with the villagers. One of the villagers asked if Phil had returned to cleanse the undead soldiers in the forest, and his assistant told them that he had not returned home, but that he had come as an adventurer to carry out a mission, and after completing it, he would leave the village. Meanwhile, Phil wondered if Kurt had looked down on him as a child. Herman told him it started when he left home, and he was worried that Phil would steal his position as heir to the knighthood, so he said he would never do that. Luca wondered why Branted didn't drink tonight and accused him of drinking from sunrise to sunset. Then Herman's wife approached Phil and told him that she felt her grandfather had become a zombie in the woods since he was the chief squire. Phil promised to find his remains and give them to her. Herman's wife was delighted and wished he was the heir to the knighthood instead of Kurt. Lena felt they were about to have a succession crisis, and Phil thought they should finish their mission quickly and leave the village. The next day, the adventurers began their mission to lure zombies into the enchanted forest by trying to provoke them with a few phrases. Ellis wondered how they lured the zombies, and Brantad told her that they respond to insults even though they're not very smart. Then the skies began to change around them. The sky turned red and zombies appeared from all sides, at which point Ellis used the purge spell and merged her powers with Phil's to expand her range. Brantad began to retrieve the remains that fall from the cleansed zombies, as anyone who tries to penetrate the spell's field fades and drops their weapons. Then Luca noticed one of the zombies that looked like a leader, and Phil realized that it was the former Duke, the leader of the army. After they succeeded in clearing a large number of the undead, they continued to search for Herman's wife's grandfather until they were surprised by a huge dragon that managed to penetrate the spell field and land among them, and they wondered that the spell did not work on him, even though he was an undead dragon. Then the dragon attacked Velma, who cut off its head with a single movement of her axe. Eliza told them that the magic would work on it, but it would take longer to cleanse it. Then they noticed that more dead monsters were coming towards them, some of which were able to penetrate the spell's field. The adventurers continued to deal with the monsters that penetrate the spell field until they finished clearing a large number of soldiers and monsters. And then Herman's wife's grandfather appeared in front of them, so Phil and Eliz approached him and were surprised that he had turned into Leech and was able to talk. He asked the zombie about his granddaughter, and Phil told him that she was married and living a happy life now, so the grandfather put down his weapon and allowed Eliz to cleanse him to rest in peace. Then they collected his remains and gave them to his granddaughter. Then Kurt ordered the villagers to hand over all rusty armor and broken swords to the blacksmith eye chart. One of them said that they didn't have the bodies of their sons to bury and wanted to keep the armor and swords instead. But Kurt told him that the village suffers from iron deficiency and the weapons will be reused to develop the village. Phil intervened and objected to Kurt's decision in turn, telling him that he was the heir to the village's rule and that a lowly man like him had no right to object to his decisions. So Phil gave him a large cube of iron in exchange for letting the people keep the remains of their sons. Kurt felt angry that his argument was invalidated, but he decided to be patient until Phil and his companions left the village. And after they returned to the Duke with the unidentified remains, Phil thought that the mission was over and he would finally lead his family's village. But he was surprised by the Duke's order to take over the hunting missions in the Enchanted Forest and the virgin lands within the village. Brantas suggested that they stay in the village for a while with his friends. Then they went to the village trustee Claus and told him that they would stay for a while until the Duke identifies the owners of the unidentified remains and that this process may take a long time. The next day, Eliza took over the funerals and helped the villagers say their prayers. Erwin wondered why she was saying the prayers, and Phil replied that the village priestess was too old to do it, while one of the villagers was upset that Kurt didn't attend the funeral. In the evening, they sat down to dinner with the villagers, and Phil marveled at Branta's refusal to drink wine in the village. Then he noticed Kurt's wife and children coming to the monument and reciting prayers, so he went towards them, and his children were amazed to see their uncle, nicknamed the Dragon Slayer, and asked him enthusiastically about the Battle of the Dragon, while Luca, Lena, and Erwin were acting a play in front of the people to represent their fight against the Bone Dragon, and after it ended, Phil gave his nephews Mizwami, which is a water candy that he prepared for them, while Brantek took advantage of his preoccupation with them and went somewhere. After the party ended, Klaus spoke with Phil privately and asked him to become the heir of the village and that it is everyone's wish to rule them as they have no future under Kurt's leadership. But Phil tried to refuse his offer to avoid trouble with his brother and that he wants to live as an adventurer, so he suggested to him to leave the lands under the reign of Brantah. Phil was surprised by his knowledge about his subordinate, but Klaus told him that he would have his support if he agreed to inherit the village's rule. Phil thought that the royal court wouldn't allow him to inherit it anyway. He told him that the members of the royal court don't care about such formalities and that's what they're aiming for. Brantah interrupted their conversation and said that the royal court wanted him to become the landlord of his village, and he told him that the royal palace wants to develop these vast lands to make a lot of money for many years, but the problem is that they are not durable because their masters were all ordinary people, including his brother Kurt. Phil said they couldn't give such succession ordered to his father, and Brantat emphasized that the other rulers would be afraid of being replaced. So the royal palace came up with a plan that would allow him to take over without trouble. They would make Kurt lose his mind, and when Phil tamed him, they would push their father out of office to take responsibility for his son, which would leave the seat vacant for him. Phil realized that they had sent him to the village deliberately to provoke Kurt, using the clearing of the enchanted forest as a good reason to send him, and that when people wanted him to be the heir, Kurt would lose his mind and try to get rid of him. Phil asks him to tell him before they go ahead with the plan. Brantat says the plan is in motion with or without his knowledge. Phil wonders what he's going to do if Kurt succeeds in taking him out, and he says they won't be able to get rid of him easily as long as he's on his watch. Phil realized that Brantat had refrained from drinking alcohol the entire time they were in the village to keep an eye on Phil and protect him from any danger to his life, and Phil wondered why the royal palace insisted that he become the governor of the lands, and Brantat told him that he was the most suitable person for the task, as he had enough money and resources to develop it. He realized that all the generous rewards he was receiving for his missions would be used to develop the lands one day, and he wondered if the palace had begun to implement his plan. Brantat said that part of what he told him was his conjecture, but the only truth was that it was time for the curtain to rise and the show to begin. Afterward, Phil was sitting there absent-mindedly, worrying about a succession struggle with his brother and fearing that it would turn into a tragedy, and his friends tried to comfort him that he would be able to continue his adventures even if he became the ruler. Then Herman entered the room to tell him that there were guests waiting for him, so he went out to meet Kurt's wife and her children, and he kept playing with them and doing light magic spells for them. And then his friends thought that what bothers him about the succession is that the two children will be deprived of their future as noblemen and may have to leave the village, and meanwhile Claus was watching the situation from afar. In the evening, a group of villagers gathered to go to Phil's palace and tell him their demands, but to their surprise, he, Herman, and Brantat appeared before them via teleportation. Herman asked them to explain what was going on, and they told him that they wanted Phil to be the heir to the throne instead of Kurt. He said that his brother would never accept that. They told him that they are not afraid of punishment, and that Kurt favors those close to him in his dealings and does not tax them, and they begged Phil to accept their rule, and he asked them to give him some time to think. They said that the Duke was about to finish the identification of the remains soon, which meant that he was close to leaving the village, but they were surprised when Phil told them that he did not plan to leave the village after the examination of the remains, and they wondered among themselves about the source of the information. Brantat noticed that Claus was watching them from a distance and realized that he was the one stirring up trouble among the people, so he went to him and told him about it. But Claus pretended not to know what Brantat was talking about, so he accused him of inciting the people to demand Phil's succession and described it as encouraging them to die. Brantat said that the royal palace does not like others to act on their behalf and warned him not to exaggerate his actions further. Claus apologized and said that he was just a simple village trustee and left in front of him. Before he left, he asked him to be careful of Kurt's wife, and in the meantime, Kurt's wife was watching them from the window. Then she went to talk to Kurt in his office, but she saw a group of people gathered in front of him and learned of his intention to follow Phil and his companions so as not to draw the attention of the villagers to him. Meanwhile, Phil returned to the palace after he managed to calm the situation outside. Erwin advised him to make a decision soon about ruling before the villagers do it again. Phil wondered what would happen to his brother if he took his place, and Brantat told him that the royal palace would wipe him out after he caused chaos. The next day, Phil decides to go talk to Kurt privately and offers to give him a share of the land when their father steps down and Kurt takes over in exchange for helping him get promoted as a noble and providing resources for the development of the village. Kurt felt that he was trying to trick him into making a sneaky deal with him so that he could grab a piece of land, and he tore up the map in front of him, accusing him of trying to steal his power to become the ruler in his place, and Phil warned him that there would be an uprising in the village. Kurt interrupted him before he could finish his speech and kicked him out of his palace. Phil, frustrated that he had failed to convince his brother, met his wife and children outside and told her that he had expected the conversation to fail, but he had tried to reach a solution that was satisfactory to all parties. Amai said that she doesn't care what anyone thinks as long as she can protect her children, and that she is deliberately bringing them closer to him to gain his sympathy and not lose their status as nobles, and that she is willing to face anything to do so. After that, Phil returned to his palace and helped his friends prepare spices and told them about his decision to become the village's ruler. He told them that he might end up hurting a lot of people in order not to follow the royal palace's plan, and told them that he would need their help when the time comes, and Ellis said that they would always be there for him. Phil started selling magical condiments, known as mayonnaise in our world, to the villagers while the others sold products and costumes from the city of Brightburg and the capital, and they were very popular, which angered Kurt and his followers. A week later, his followers told him that Phil's store and his friends had taken all the customers of their stores, and one of them suggested that they should eliminate him, but Kurt rejected the idea, telling him that they were facing a magician and that he should be able to beat them. The next day, Kurt received the news that his followers betrayed him and took Phil's side after he provided them with all the resources resources they needed in exchange for going with him to the capital to learn to master their craft and not need to stick to Kurt, thus weakening the ranks of his supporters until he was alone, hoping that he would lose his mind and everything would go according to plan. Phil and Rodrigue head to an empty apartment he bought to secure Amai and her children's lives after the riots in the village. Then Rodrigue suggests that they bring Kurt to hide in the church so that the royal palace cannot reach him and harm him. Phil wondered how the palace was doing, and Rodrigue told him that the number of people wanting to meet him had been increasing lately, and it seemed that they were after the rights to the leftover land to ensure their share of the large returns after its development was completed. In the meantime, Alice had already sent one of his henchmen to keep an eye on them and then gave him a trumpet to start the plan. Meanwhile, Kurt was yelling at his henchmen for not showing up for the village meeting and was furious when he realized that they had all gone with Phil. Then he told him that he came to him with an offer that day with the rest of his followers to train in the capital, and Kurt was shocked that all his followers abandoned him for his brother's generous offers. So he decided to get rid of him himself and put a hood on his head and brought a small dagger, but he was surprised by the appearance of Alice Rockner's follower, sarcastically wondering if he would be able to get rid of him with this weapon. Then he took out of his pocket a flute and told him that it is a magical tool known as the dragon flute and will guarantee him more than the dagger to eliminate Phil. He then tells Kurt that Alice is sorry for giving him false information and wants to make amends, and offers to take the dragon flute for free in exchange for leniency in negotiations for the leftover lands when he takes over, and Kurt agrees to cooperate with them. The next day, Brantak sensed Kurt's presence near them and told everyone that he was coming towards them after swallowing the rumors of Phil entering the Westlands by himself, and they were surprised that he came alone without bringing anyone with him. Phil realizes that he's come to fight him and heads towards him alone to talk to him, but Kurt knows his followers are in the back and asks them to appear in front of him and praises him, mocking all his accomplishments, including his attempt to become the new ruler of the territories. Brantak was amazed that he had such a tool in his possession. He then explained to Phil what a dragon flute was, and that Kurt could summon all the dragons north of the Rig Mountains through it and they wouldn't be able to withstand it. Erwin warned him that he would be in danger with them if he did that. He laughed at the naivety of his thinking that he could use a tool that would put him in danger, and told Phil that he would gain a new family after the dragons wiped out everything here, steal his property, and develop the land to become a greater hero than himself. Phil was angered by his words and his willingness to give up his family and brothers for power and influence, but Kurt warned him not to make a move and felt the satisfaction of having control over them. So Brantak tried to attack him with a magic spell to make the flute fall out of his hand, but to no avail. Kurt then said that the death of everyone Phil knew would be his fault before he blew the flute and summoned the dragons of the Sea Mountains, but they were surprised by the appearance of ghosts from underground, and Phil tried to approach him, but Velma stopped him after she had a bad feeling about these creatures and told Eliz that what he was hovering around was feelings of hatred. Then Brantak said that whoever gave Kurt this flute deceived him, as this is called the Flute of Malice, which draws malice from its surroundings to defeat its enemies, and the malice will turn Kurt into a zombie. Meanwhile, negative thoughts were swirling in Kurt's mind, who continued to play the flute thinking that he would succeed in getting rid of them all. Then he turned into a huge monster full of hatred after Kurt's body hardened inside him, and Phil was shocked by his brother's appearance after being possessed by hatred, and then Brantak told him to use his holy magic to purify him since he had already died after his transformation. When the monster tries to attack them, Ellis creates a magical barrier to stop it and decides to purge it herself, but Kurt's malice is too much for her to resist alone. Phil came to his senses and told her to expand her power as they had done in the Enchanted Forest, and he joined forces with her, and they succeeded in cleansing the monster, and the stone containing Kurt's body shattered into crumbs. Meanwhile, Alice throws a big party in honor of the successful assassination of Phil, expecting to hear good news, but to their surprise, Kurt's vengeful spirit breaks into the mansion and devours everyone inside, including Alice Rockner. The next day, the guards arrived and barricaded the palace gate after news of the death of Alice, and 12 nobles spread, and Rodrigue realized that his father was responsible for what happened to Kurt, so he wanted to take revenge on him for deceiving him. He then told Phil that they would have a hard time moving Kurt's wife and children to the capital, since they had become relatives of a criminal, and it would be difficult for them to adapt within the community, and Phil learned that they were now secretly living with the family's second son. Phil felt confused about the fate of his brother's family, as everyone looks at them with hostility and cannot go out freely, and he felt like he failed to save anyone despite his status among all those who call him a hero, and Armstrong told him that he had no results about his research on how he got the flute. Brantak said that he had been thinking the same thing for some time, but that he had spoken about it like a normal person and asked him not to forget that he was a nobleman, no matter what. Phil kept thinking about his life and his social status affecting it and felt out of touch with reality, which he started to feel in the last episode. He tells Eliz that he thinks it's because he hasn't accepted this world and thought he'd be ready to live a normal life. She tells him that he always does his best and does it smartly, and encourages him that she has faith in his abilities. The next day, Phil went to the royal palace to be honored by the king king for his work in putting out the accident in Baumeister village and giving him all the leftover land there. Then the king asked him what he wanted as a personal reward. Phil asked for the right to grant the title of nobility to 2 people of his choice, as there were many vacancies due to the incident with the flute of malice. But the king became angry and told him that the right to grant titles belongs to the king alone, and everyone expressed their displeasure at his impudent request. Edgar seized the opportunity and asked the king to give him a portion of the leftover lands in exchange for someone with more experience in managing them, and nominated Baron Mark, known as the greatest developer in the kingdom. Ragnar objected to Edgar's request as Mark was a relative. Duke Amadeo said that he had witnessed events in the past where the right to give titles to others had been granted and should be taken into consideration. Edgar accused him of trying to expand his faction by granting one of his subjects the right to grant titles, and everyone kept arguing about the matter, which disrupted the order of the royal palace. So Armstrong ordered everyone to remain silent and asked Phil to retract his request, and suggested to the king to fulfill Edgar's request by giving him a small part of the land and promising to develop it himself. But the king decided to give all the land to Phil to develop it with his magical powers, and to everyone's surprise, he agreed to grant the right to confer titles, and Armstrong looked at him out of the corner of his eye and winked at him, indicating that he had tried to influence the king's decision indirectly. The king then granted him the 5th rank and title of Earl for land development, and Ragnar was surprised that he had passed the full rank of Viscount and become an Earl, whereupon Phil took the oath of the realm. Armstrong was surprised that the king was aware of his anger at Phil's request and told him to practice his acting more next time. Meanwhile, Phil decided to give the 2 titles he had to Kurt's sons when they turned 15. A few days later, Phil started working on the development of the abandoned land with the help of the laborers after laying out the land for them from huge rocks. Then he decided to return home and let Erwin and Rodrigue supervise the laborers. But Rodrigue asked him to take care of the neighboring areas, as they will build a church under the patronage of Huanheim in addition to the lands owned by Edgar, Ragnar, and Duke Amadeus. Phil did not mind this, as he owes thanks to them for granting the king the right to confer titles, and took out of his pocket an imaginary drawing of the project he intends to build, a workshop for making soy sauce and miso.